All right. Welcome once again. My name is Kirti Jaikumar, and I founded and run the Gender Security Project. And we are so excited and glad to welcome all of you to our side event as part of NGO-CSW 66. Today's event will be 2 hours or almost 2 hours of action-packed engagement. In the first half, you will hear from us about our work, what we do, our views on feminist foreign policy, and the factors that motivate us to do the work that we do. We will also be spending some time to set the context for the second half of today's session. And in setting the context, we will talk to you about why we think a feminist foreign policy approach is relevant to 5 of the contemporary challenges the world is facing across the board. This will then be followed up by breakout rooms where you will have the freedom to choose among 5 breakout rooms to join. And in these breakout rooms, your voice will play the role more than us. In these breakout rooms, we invite you to envision with us, to co-create with us, and to come out with what your vision for the future in the form of a feminist foreign policy would look like. In the course of this session, the chat function will be open. You're free to use the chat function to respond to what we're saying, to ask your questions. And while we may not be able to take your questions in the flow of our speaking, we'll make sure that you do not leave the session without an answer one way or another, if that's in chat or in our breakout rooms. Who are we? We're from the Gender Security Project, an initiative based out of Chennai. Chennai is in South India, for those of you who are not yet familiar with the city. And we work at the cross-section of women, peace and security and feminist foreign policy, with a focus on the majority world perspective through research, reportage, and documentation. Our work over the past 2 years since its founding, and was every bit the pandemic baby, has centered on 4 key areas, with a 5th one on its way. We've worked in the space of women, peace and security through research and reportage in the form of articles, researched briefs, and documented case studies from across the world in terms of how the women, peace and security agenda has been implemented on ground. We also engage with the theme of foreign policy through a feminist lens, or feminist foreign policy as it's come to be known, but from a very determined majority world focus that takes away from the conventional add women and stir approach that we've all become too familiar with. We also engage with transitional justice through research and reportage, with again a focus on moving away from very limiting systems and structures to the ways in which transitional justice is operated outside the mainframes in the global south and the majority world. We've also set up the conflict-related sexual violence observatory, which documents reports of sexual violence in a mass scale across armed conflicts, both across the world and time. While the observatory itself has not been inaugurated formally, we have a dedicated section on our website with these case studies mapped. The observatory will be out in April, and if you would like to receive any information on the observatory and its launch event, please feel free to reach out to us on info@gendersecurityproject.com. And a final limb of our work that's coming out in the next couple of months is a dedicated course on peace mediation. Our aim is to increase the number of women and non-binary peace mediators across the world. And to do that, we hope to equip them with the skills they need to both be mediators and to understand the dynamics of the law and policies and systems that play in post-conflict peace processes. So that's broadly about our work. And in today's conversation, we are going to specifically engage on feminist foreign policy, informed by our view of what feminist foreign policy is, followed by room for you to share your views with us. In our understanding, a feminist foreign policy strives to shift the weathered approach of foreign policy through the lens of inclusion, intersectionality, and sustainable peace. To us, a feminist foreign policy informs and defines interactions both among states and with non-state actors as well, such as multinational institutions, organizations, and civil society, and individuals like you and me. To us, a feminist foreign policy prioritizes peace, gender equality, environmental integrity, respect for the common heritage of humankind, justice, and intersectionality. We believe that it promotes and protects the human rights of all, with due efforts directed entirely toward dismantling systemic and structural violence, included but not limited to colonialism, racism, casteism, extractivism, and of course, patriarchy. To us, like I started this session, Feminist foreign policy transcends the add woman and stir approach and adopts the collective wisdom of feminist security and legal principles to dismantle all forms of systemic violence and normalize sustainable peace. Now, in today's session, we are going to take a deep dive into 5 areas in which we believe a feminist foreign policy-led solution would make a tremendous difference to the dynamics in the world we see today. And these areas are climate change, diplomacy and international relations, economy and trade, international law and justice, and international security. You can see the names of the people who will be leading a very brief presentation on each of these soon after I finish. And I'm going to stop at this point and yield the floor to my colleague Raki, who will lead you on feminist foreign policy solutions to end climate change. Over to you, Raki.
Yeah, thank you, Kirti, and welcome everyone. You'd all know that climate change has been making the news for a long time, but we haven't really done much. We've talked a lot about climate change, climate action, seen the effects of natural disasters, but we haven't done much about it. And when it comes to feminist foreign policy, when we go away from the traditional foreign policies and make environmental integrity and social justice, climate justice, environmental justice, put it at the heart of feminist foreign policy, we can look at a change in how policies can make lives better for all of us. So one of the main reasons why feminist foreign policy is not taking on is our feminist, patriarchal mindset and the lack of feminist and women leaders in positions of power, positions which negotiate and allow for climate policies to come in. When we shape climate change prevention, climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation policies, when we ask and we approach for climate finance and shape carbon offsetting, none of this has a voice, an equal voice of women and feminist leaders. It is not gender equal, and that itself makes the fact that climate change is a threat multiplier and doesn't have an inclusive voice in its shape causes most of the problem. So when I will be talking about putting climate change into framing of feminist foreign policy, I will be talking about how the voices of the marginalized and the not privileged and the people at the borders should be able to shape this foreign policy. So that's my take on it. Back to Kirti.
Thank you so much, Raki. That was good context setting there. We will discuss this more in your breakout room. Folks, you will be led by Raki in an individual breakout room. So if climate change is what you want to discuss today, please bear in mind there'll be a separate breakout room for that. Now I'd like to call on Vaishnavi Palapotu, who will be leading us with a brief presentation on feminist foreign policy solutions to diplomacy.
Thank you so much, Kirti, and welcome everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm so excited to hear from all of you about your views on feminist foreign policy. So I'm currently a master's student studying IR and diplomacy, and I think this is where my interests really lie. So far, the agenda on feminist foreign policy has largely been set by the global north, and it has been seen as something that is done on the global south and not with the global south or the majority world. And as we've witnessed with the cases of, say, Sweden and Canada, the discrepancies that exist between how the state conducts itself with feminist intentions actually ends up undermining any attempts to shift the traditional approaches to international relations and foreign policy. For example, both of these countries continue to export, manufacture, and deal with arms, which is inherently antithetical to a feminist foreign policy. A truly decolonial and feminist and intersectional feminist foreign policy also implies that there is a commitment to transforming, challenging, and dismantling oppressive structures and systems, and any foreign policy that does not address these structural causes is just merely a smokescreen or putting lipstick on a pig, as we would say. And of course, there have been inequalities between the conception and the implementation of feminist foreign policies across the world, even though there have only been a handful of countries that have formally adopted one. And these are exacerbated by the inconsistencies between rhetoric and actual action. So let's take the example of an issue of migration and the refugee crises. Because states tend to separate borders from their territories, this has led to increased militarization, privatizing security, a lot of border vigilance, and the incentive to profit from those who actually are seeking safe havens in different countries. And this has a disproportionate effect on those from oppressed races, oppressed religions, those with darker skin colors, and those who identify as something that is beyond the non-cis gender identity. And we have definitely seen this played out in racist media Western reportage of the Russia-Ukraine war most recently. And of course, the Eurocentric philosophy of international politics that dominates international relations today doesn't consider the sovereignty or foreign policy actions beyond the limit of the state. Indigenous actors, and particularly women of color, have been important and crucial players in foreign policy, if not traditionally considered foreign policy actors. And their lived experiences are often neglected. So by refocusing international relations away from the usual Western quarters in making means that we make available resources and opportunities to practitioners who are marginalized by their gender, caste, race, geography, etc. And it means putting marginalized people front and center, putting their lived experiences front and center, not just including them at the table, but creating a whole new table for them. A truly intersectional feminist foreign policy will also center intersectional inclusion. And I believe that production of knowledge is an important first step in this regard. So it should work in solidarity with communities and peoples who are disregarded and dismissed as legitimate knowledge producers. So that's the brief context in which I hope to discuss further with some of you in my breakout room. And yeah, thank you. Over to you, Kirti.
Thank you so much, Vaishnavi, again for setting that context on the role of feminist foreign policy in shaping diplomacy. If any of you would like to join the separate breakout room, please watch out for the menu on the breakout rooms towards the end of about 20 minutes from now to join Vaishnavi's breakout room on feminist foreign policy solutions to diplomacy. I would now like to invite Basanti Shweta to talk about feminist foreign policy solutions for the challenges in the economy and trade sector. Basanti?
Thank you so much, Kirti. Welcome, everybody. I'm incredibly grateful to be a part of this and to share space with everybody. I'm looking forward to the rest of the session. Like Rakhi and Vaishnavi have pointed out, I will be looking at feminist approaches to international or foreign policy in the context of economy and trade. Now, political economy or international economy most often deals with understanding reallocation and redistribution of resources across nations, the global positioning of these nations in terms of their GDP, etc. In terms of how international ties work in the context of economy and how pre-conflict, post-conflict environments impact the economy. Now, we understand and acknowledge that this is important for sustainable development as well as a sustainable peace. But what is lacking in this spectrum is how we define these socioeconomic indicators, how we interpret these issues, as well as the solutions or the decisions we take in these contexts. How do they manifest, and are there gender gaps or lack of gender awareness in the space is what I would like to talk about in the breakout room, and I'm hoping to learn about as well. And in order to look at these gaps, I look at them in 3 different branches. One, what I like to call the definition branch. When you look at issues in the economy or issues in trade policies, how we define an issue, either from a policy-making point of view or a research point of view, that in itself inherently has problems. For example, one common issue that we've researched time and again is something on the lines of, say, expenditure on infrastructure, right? Let's assume we look at infrastructural investments in terms of roadways. How often do we look at research or policy in the context of, say, safety and mobility when we look at that kind of a research? And the other, or the next gap that I like to look at is the measurement or the indicator gap. When you look at a particular statistic or a measurement to identify a particular economic problem, say interest rates or credit rates or anything of that sort, how inclusive is that indicator? Does that indicator treat all genders to be the same? Does it become gender aware because it is that one reflection of the issue does not take into account any kind of diversity at all? And the last gap that I like to talk about is the outcome gap. When I look at a particular issue or a policy in terms of the economy, how often am I targeting it for the gender diversity that exists? For example, how often are we looking at the costs of gender discrimination or the costs of gender equality? So I look at these definition gaps and the way where we measure it, or the outcomes we target in itself to be slightly detached from intersectionality and feminism, and that is what I like to discuss and know and learn more about during the breakout room. And I'm interested to know what all of you have to offer and from your experience, and I'm looking forward. So yes, thank you so much, Kirti.
Thank you so much for that, Vasanti. So if you work in the space of economy and trade, or if this is an area that interests you, we do have a breakout room where you will be led by Vasanti in a discussion on feminist foreign policy solutions to the challenges she just outlined in the space of economy and trade. From here, I'd like to speak about feminist legal theory and the adoption of a feminist legal model for international law. Now, the current international legal paradigm as it exists lacks meaningful and binding force. It follows what's known as a consent-based application system, which means that a state is bound by the treaties it signs and by the customary norms that it does not persistently or previously have objected to. Now, this automatically means that certain states may choose not to be subject to certain laws. And we're seeing this played out, whether it's in the exercise of a veto or even in just not being a signatory to a convention. The costs of non-adherence to the law are borne by states that don't make the decision for that particular state not to comply with the law. The current international legal system as it exists was formed at the end of the Second World War. It has a Westphalian system informing it. It is Eurocentric in its focus, and the agency of the majority world, most of which emerged from the yoke of colonialization at the end of the Second World War, has been completely obliterated and ignored. Needless to say, the systems of patriarchy, structural violence, and systemic imbalances, including racism and colonialism, continue to inform the application of international law as we know it. States are quick to hold other states accountable. Those of whom that are less powerful are often held accountable by states that are more powerful, which somehow consider themselves above the law. Case in point, the United States has signed the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, but has just not ratified it. And yet it calls itself a superpower. As we see in the context of international law and its application, specific forms, international criminal law and humanitarian law, have also not evolved with the times. Mary Kaldor has spoken about how the way we do war has evolved into what we now know as new war. And new wars are informed by massive forms of weaponization that include even the internet as an arena. But our humanitarian laws, which address conflict and conduct in conflict, have not evolved to match this. Today, as we see international law manifest, it is neither gendered nor intersectional in its framing and its application. It continues to be top-down and does not acknowledge the role for non-state actors. In my breakout room, I hope to invite those of you who have worked with the law or who are interested in the law and in the idea of justice to think through some of these challenges that we have, and maybe inform from your understanding what a feminist foreign policy-led solution could look like in shaping the way both law is applied and justice is done. So that would be my breakout room, and you can watch for a breakout room titled International Law and Justice to join when we move into the breakout room sections. I would now like to yield the floor to my colleague Nivedita to talk about security. Nivedita?
Hi, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Keerthi. My name is Nivedita. I also go by Nivi. I'm a researcher at Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, also known as SIPRI, where I work on space security, disarmament, and gender. So I thought today I'll briefly summarize the issues with international security as we know it, and why we need tools such as feminist foreign policy to transform some of these dynamics. International security it's built on these traditional power hierarchies, and there are clear distributions of power. And while these dynamics may be slowly evolving with some newer states changing and challenging this traditional balance, in the process, global South actors often risk being viewed as recipients of norms and these practices, rather than actually having the agency to play a role in norm creation. And it's important to keep these dynamics and concerns in mind because they can be replicated in the context of feminist foreign policy as well if we are not careful. And a key issue with regulation in its current form is that our field tends to adopt very binary approaches. So even when we consider new policies and we evaluate evidence for processes, we risk using the same processes and approaches that are built on these same balances of power, which are outdated and very simplistic. And Vaishnavi already, she touched upon this in her introduction to FFP and diplomacy and IR. But I would like maybe to give some more examples of these binary approaches and why they're problematic. Often when you see gender being discussed in the international security context, you will ironically see gender being equated with sex when these discussions are underway. And by that, I mean interpreting feminist foreign policy and disarmament simply as the need for equal representation of men and women. While such an approach may be well-intentioned, perhaps, it also adopts a sex-based and a biological approach to security and disarmament. It fails to treat gender as a spectrum, and it does not provide room for gender analyses and perspectives in the field. Another example is the prevailing notion that conflict creates only two experiences, that of a victim and that of an agent, who is usually assumed to be the combatant. This excludes the factors that led the person in question to becoming a combatant. And similarly, we have similar binaries of militaristic or protectionist approaches, meaning that these are the only possible solutions for action in the security space. And the problem with this is with all of these contexts is that there is a whole range of experiences that is missing from analysis. And there are gendered implications for every one of these skewed assumptions. These approaches can also result in the homogenization of experiences, that there is a singular universal woman, and this is evident in our laws and treaties. And I think that Keerthi would also be touching upon this. If we look at how our treaties have been drafted, looking at even the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols, there are a number of provisions which identify women to primarily be mothers, and assuming that this is the only identity that exists. And so there is still much work left to be done to fully understand the broad range of contexts and experiences in the law of armed conflict and in law and policy, and this applies to the security field as well. I also want to emphasize that experts have gathered data and shared evidence on how there are divisions even within the international security community. We often see feminist foreign policy linked with commitments under the UN Women, Peace and Security agenda. Yet there's still a disconnect between the Women, Peace, Security agenda and arms control, disarmament and non-proliferation. The Security Council resolutions on WPS, they don't contain as many references to arms control and disarmament. The meetings on WPS have rarely addressed governance of weapons. However, national action plans have increasingly incorporated arms control, some arms control and disarmament focus areas, such as small arms and light weapons. Yet there is a broad disconnect between these two fields. And I think that we see a clear evidence of suffering from the absence of these explicit connections. Furthermore, past and ongoing attempts to prioritize gender in arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation, they also have challenges. Inclusivity and intersectionality are often preached but not practiced. There is still a lack of acknowledgement of overlapping dimensions with gender, including race, nationality, caste, sexual orientation, and ability. And while gendered perspectives in this area are growing, they are still incredibly limited. Our legal instruments have some gender responsive provisions, but even then there are challenges with enforcement and implementation. And so what we need from disarmament and international security, what we need is to center experiences of those most affected, learn from them, and find out how actors can shape norms and practices rather than just receiving them. We need to actively work towards regulation that understands and includes these different contexts, and we need to question the approaches traditionally taken to address these issues, questioning the bias of binary perspectives, and overall seek a complete understanding of the full range of these experiences. So feminist foreign policy, well, I should say intersectional feminist foreign policy, can be a useful tool for gender-responsive arms control and disarmament. And that's something that I hope to discuss with you and learn more in my breakout room today.
Thank you so much for that, Nivedita. Folks who are interested in the space of security, disarmament, do look out to join the breakout room with the same title, and Nivedita will be moderating that segment. So this is what will happen over the next couple of minutes and then an hour after. We will open up breakout rooms, as I mentioned, 5 areas: climate change, diplomacy and IR, economy and trade, international law and justice, and international security. Please join the breakout room that speaks most to your area of interest. Please don't feel encumbered by the need to demonstrate any expertise of any sort. Even if you're somebody that just likes the field and has a few thoughts to share, we're more than happy to welcome them and receive them from your end. So once you get into your breakout rooms, the moderators will lead you through a series of questions. As I mentioned at the top of the session, this is being recorded, but when we report out, we will be following the Chatham rules, which means that no person will be identified in the contributions that will be listed out eventually. However, if you feel like you have something to share with your breakout room that you feel might be confidential, might best be confidential, you're welcome to let the moderator know, and they will pause the recording and resume.